Most beaches are just sand and water, but some of them have currents that drag you under before you can turn around, sharks that treat the surf zone as a feeding corridor, radiation you can't see, and fog so thick that ships have been dying in it for centuries. 10 beaches, all of them real, all of them still open, counting down from 10 to 1. Number 10, Bikini Atoll, Marshall Islands. The name sounds like a swimsuit. That's the joke the universe decided to make. Bikini Atoll sits in the central Pacific, a ring of coral islands enclosing a lagoon about 50 kilometers across, roughly the width of the English Channel at its narrowest. From the air, it looks like a postcard. Turquoise water, white sand, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly unreal. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices here. 23. The largest, Castle Bravo, was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The original inhabitants were relocated before the tests began. They were told it would be temporary. Most never returned permanently. The islands were declared safe for resettlement in the 1960s, then unsafe again in the 1970s when soil tests showed cesium-137 levels far above what was considered acceptable. The coconuts, it turned out, were pulling radioactive material straight up through the roots. The food chain was contaminated from the ground up, and then UNESCO listed it as a World Heritage Site in 2010, not despite the damage, because of it. The citation describes Bikini as a symbol of the dawn of the nuclear age, a place preserved in part because of what was done to it. The lagoon holds the Ghost Fleet. During the tests, the U.S. Navy assembled over 90 vessels as target ships, battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, and positioned them in the atoll to measure the effects of the blasts. Many sank. They're still there. The USS Saratoga lies at a depth of about 50 meters, her flight deck largely intact, her hull now colonized by coral and fish. Divers come from across the world to swim through her hangars. The water is clear enough to see the whole ship from above. But here's where it turns. The fish are not safe to eat. The coral has recovered visually, but the sediment on the seafloor still carries measurable radioactive contamination. Coconut crabs on the islands, which absorb cesium through the food they consume, test above safe consumption thresholds. The place looks healed. The measurements say otherwise. There's a particular quality to that contradiction. A lagoon so beautiful that people travel thousands of kilometers to dive it, knowing the fish they're swimming past are inedible, knowing the sand below the ships is still registering on instruments. The danger here isn't a current or a predator. It's invisible, slow, and distributed through every living thing in the ecosystem. Bikini's permanent population is 0. The Bikinian people live primarily on Kili Island, displaced for nearly 80 years now. The atoll sits largely uninhabited, monitored, occasionally visited. The warships rust slowly in the lagoon. The coral grows over them. What it means that the most pristine-looking water on this list is also the most contaminated. That's a question the atoll has been sitting with for decades, and it hasn't finished answering it yet. At number 9, Gansbay, South Africa. Great white shark capital of the world is not a marketing tagline someone put on a brochure. It's a biological fact confirmed by population surveys. The stretch of water between Dyer Island and Geyser Rock, a channel roughly 150 meters wide, has the highest documented concentration of great white sharks of any coastal location on Earth. Researchers named it Shark Alley. The name is accurate. Dyer Island sits about 8 kilometers off the coast of Gansby, a small fishing town on the Western Cape. Geyser Rock, just across the channel, hosts a colony of roughly 60,000 Cape fur seals. That number is key. 60,000 seals in a confined space, constantly entering and leaving the water, is essentially a permanent buffet positioned at the edge of a shark nursery. The great whites didn't choose this location arbitrarily. The food supply chose it for them, and the sharks followed. The channel itself is narrow enough to swim across in theory. In practice, researchers have recorded multiple great whites in the channel simultaneously, some exceeding 5 meters in length, roughly the size of a mid-range family car, nose to tail. They breach here. Full breaches, launching their entire bodies out of the water while hunting seals near the surface. It's one of the few places on Earth where that behavior is reliably observable, which is exactly why the cage diving industry built itself around this specific patch of ocean. And that's the thing about Gansby that makes it genuinely strange. The danger didn't drive people away. It became the attraction. Cage diving operations have run here since the early 1990s, lowering tourists in steel cages into the channel to watch great whites pass at arm's length. At the industry's peak, dozens of boats were operating out of the harbor, drawing visitors from across the world specifically to be in the water with the sharks. The danger and the tourism are not in tension here. They're the same product. There's a separate debate about whether the cage diving operations, which use chum and bait to attract sharks, have altered the sharks' behavior over time, potentially conditioning them to associate boats and human activity with food. South African authorities have tightened regulations significantly since the early 2000s, restricting chumming practices and limiting operator numbers. The science on behavioral conditioning remains contested. What's not contested is that the shark population in this region is substantial, resident, and highly active. Gansby also sits within a broader stretch of South African coastline with a documented history of fatal shark attacks. The Western Cape has recorded more fatal great white interactions than almost any other region globally. Most involve surfers or swimmers at beaches further along the coast, not the cage diving operations where the containment is the point. The open beaches are a different calculation entirely. So you have a town that built its economy around the most dangerous predator in the ocean, positioned directly between a massive seal colony and open water, running boats into the channel for paying tourists, while the surrounding coastline carries one of the highest attack records in the world. The seals still outnumber the sharks by thousands to one. They enter the water anyway, every day, because the alternative is starvation. Whether that's courage or just biology probably depends on how much you want to read into it. 8. Kauai Beach, Mumbai. Every August, somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people walk into the water here on purpose. They're carrying clay idols of Ganesh, some small enough to hold in two hands, some taller than a person, and they submerge them as part of Ganesh Chaturthi, one of the largest religious festivals in India. The idols dissolve. The ritual is centuries old. The water they're dissolving into is another matter entirely. Kauai Beach sits at the northern end of Marine Drive in South Mumbai, a curved stretch of sand facing the Arabian Sea. The location is genuinely striking. The city rises behind it, the bay opens in front, and on most evenings the beach is crowded with families, food vendors, and people walking the shoreline. It functions as a public park for a city of over 20 million people. That context matters because it explains why the beach remains in constant use despite water quality data that would close most beaches in the world permanently. Fecal coliform bacteria levels at Kauai have been recorded at hundreds of times above the threshold considered safe for bathing by international standards. The Brihanmumbai Municipal Corporation has tested the water repeatedly over the years, and the results are consistent. The beach fails. Untreated sewage discharge into the bay combined with stormwater runoff from one of the world's most densely populated urban areas has produced water quality that health authorities have repeatedly warned against entering. Swimming is officially discouraged. People wade in anyway because the festival doesn't stop and the beach doesn't close. The idol immersion compounds the problem in a specific way. Traditional Ganesh idols were made from natural clay and painted with plant-based dyes, which dissolved without significant environmental impact. The shift toward plaster of Paris idols, cheaper, more durable before immersion, capable of holding finer detail, introduced a material that doesn't break down cleanly. Plaster of Paris releases calcium sulfate into the water as it dissolves, and the chemical paints used on mass-produced idols have been found to contain heavy metals including mercury, cadmium, and lead. Studies of sediment near immersion sites have documented elevated heavy metal concentrations in the years following widespread adoption of synthetic materials. There have been sustained efforts to reverse this. The municipal government has promoted natural clay idols and offered collection points for artificial ones. Some communities have shifted voluntarily. The scale of the festival, hundreds of thousands of idols immersed across Mumbai over 10 days, means even partial adoption of synthetic materials produces a measurable chemical load in the water. And then there's the physical hazard. Chowpatty's surf is deceptively mild most of the year, but the bay's currents are unpredictable during the monsoon season, which overlaps directly with Ganesh Chaturthi. Drownings during the festival are documented annually. People entering the water in large crowds at night, carrying objects in water with near zero visibility. The conditions are not controlled. The emotional weight of the ritual and the physical conditions of the water exist in direct tension, and the water doesn't make accommodations. What makes Chowpatty genuinely difficult to categorize is that the danger here isn't predatory or geological. It's the accumulated consequence of a city of 20 million people sharing one shoreline with infrastructure that hasn't kept pace with density, and a festival that draws the entire population to the water's edge once a year regardless. The beach isn't hostile, it's just overwhelmed. The municipal government has announced desalination and sewage treatment upgrades periodically over the past 2 decades. The water quality data has not yet reflected those announcements in any sustained way. 7. Playa Zipolite, Mexico. Rip currents are not a Zipolite invention. Every beach with breaking waves produces them to some degree. Water pushed shoreward by waves has to return seaward somehow, and it finds the path of least resistance, typically a gap in a sandbar or a channel carved by the seafloor's geometry. What makes Zipolite different is the geometry itself. The beach sits on the Pacific coast of Oaxaca, exposed to open ocean swell with no protective reef and a seafloor that drops away steeply close to shore. The currents here don't behave like the rip currents at a typical beach. They're structural, persistent, built into the shape of the place. The locals named it Playa de los Muertos, Beach of the Dead. That name predates tourism, which tells you something about the timeline of awareness versus the timeline of use. Zipolite is about 500 meters of dark sand backed by low jungle, with the Sierra Madre del Sur rising behind it. The water is a deep, clear blue that reads as inviting from the shore. The waves break hard and close to the beach, which compresses the rip current channels into a narrow zone, meaning the pull, when it catches a swimmer, is concentrated and fast. People who've been caught describe being moved laterally and seaward simultaneously, faster than they could swim against it. The correct response to a rip current, swim parallel to shore until you exit the current's channel, then return, requires knowing you're in one before panic sets in. That window is short. Drownings at Zipolite were a consistent annual occurrence for decades. The beach had no lifeguard service for most of its history as a destination. In the 1970s and 80s, Zipolite developed a reputation as a remote, clothing-optional beach attracting travelers who wanted isolation, which meant the people entering the water were often unfamiliar with the specific conditions, and there was no infrastructure to warn them. The combination of strong currents, no reef, steep seafloor, and absent safety services produced a drowning rate that eventually prompted a local response. La Cruz Roja Zipolite, a volunteer lifeguard corps, was established by local residents who had watched the deaths accumulate over years. The organization operates on donations and community support, not municipal funding. The lifeguards patrol the beach, post flags indicating current conditions, and perform rescues that, by their own documented records, number in the hundreds annually. A single volunteer station on a 500-meter beach, staffed by people who took the job because no one else would. The drowning rate dropped measurably after their establishment. It did not reach zero. The clothing-optional status of the beach is not incidental to the risk profile. Swimmers without wetsuits, without fins, without any equipment, just skin, and the assumption that warm water means safe water, enter a current system that doesn't adjust for preparation level. The Pacific off Oaxaca is warm enough that the water temperature itself doesn't signal danger. There's no cold shock to announce that conditions are serious. The hazard is invisible until it has you. Zipolite remains open, remains popular, and remains clothing optional. The volunteer lifeguards are still there, still operating on donations, still pulling people out of the same channels in the same stretch of water. The flags they post, green for calm, yellow for caution, red for dangerous, change daily based on swell and current conditions. On red flag days, people still enter the water. The beach didn't earn its original name from outsiders who misunderstood it. The people who named it lived there. They knew exactly what the water did. Number 6. Fraser Island, the largest sand island on Earth, 122 kilometers long and up to 22 kilometers wide, roughly the length of Greater London, end to end, made entirely of sand. Not sandy. Sand. No bedrock underneath. No rock base to anchor anything. The whole island is a dune system, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years, and it sits off the coast of Queensland in southeastern Australia. It's been listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1992. It is also one of the few places on Earth where the full suite of coastal hazards, sharks, jellyfish, rip currents, and apex land predators operate simultaneously and in close proximity to each other. Start with the water. The surf beaches on Fraser Island's eastern shore are exposed to open Pacific swell with no reef protection. The rip currents are strong and consistent. The water is also inhabited by Irukandji jellyfish, a species roughly the size of a thumbnail, nearly transparent in the water, whose sting delivers a venom that causes a syndrome including severe pain, hypertension, and, in documented cases, brain hemorrhage and cardiac arrest. You cannot see them. There is no reliable way to detect their presence before contact. Swimming in the surf on Fraser Island's eastern beaches is officially discouraged by Queensland Parks and Wildlife. The freshwater lakes in the island's interior are the recommended alternative for swimming. The sharks are a separate issue. Bull sharks and tiger sharks are documented in the waters around Fraser Island. Bull sharks in particular are adapted to both salt and freshwater environments and are found in the island's rivers and estuaries as well as the surrounding ocean. They are not a theoretical presence. They are resident. And then there are the dingoes. Fraser Island hosts one of the last remaining populations of pure strain dingoes in Australia, not hybridized with domestic dogs, genetically distinct, and behaviorally wild in ways that mainland dingo populations, which have interbred with domestic animals over generations, are not. The Fraser Island dingoes have been involved in multiple attacks on humans, predominantly children. In April 2001, a 9-year-old boy named Clinton Gage was killed by dingoes on the island, the first confirmed fatal dingo attack on a human in Australia in decades. The attack prompted a significant review of dingo management policy on the island and led to the culling of dingoes identified as aggressive. Attacks, though non-fatal, have continued to be documented in subsequent years. The management response has been to post warnings, enforce rules against feeding dingoes, and recommend that children not be left unattended outdoors. The dingoes have not adjusted their behavior in response to the signage. If you're enjoying the video, drop a like and a comment. It really does help the channel out. And stay with us. Because the beaches coming up don't just have multiple hazards running at once, they have hazards that are invisible until it's already too late. What makes Fraser Island genuinely unusual in the context of dangerous beaches is the layering. Most hazardous beaches have a primary danger, a specific current, a specific predator, a specific contamination. Fraser Island has a concurrent system. Irukandji in the surf, bull sharks in the estuaries, pure strain dingoes on the beach itself, and rip currents along the entire eastern shore. The island doesn't present these dangers sequentially. They occupy the same space at the same time. The island was renamed Kauai in 2023, restoring the Butchulla name, which translates roughly as paradise. That's not irony. That's just what it looks like from the shore. White sand, clear water, ancient forest rising behind the dunes. The danger is distributed through every layer of the ecosystem, from the surf to the tree line. It doesn't announce itself. Hanakapiai Beach. Number 5. There's a sign at the trailhead. Handwritten, weathered, fixed to a post where the Pali Coast Trail begins on Kauai North Shore. It lists the names of people who have drowned at Hanakapiai Beach, updated periodically as the count rises. The number has exceeded 200. The sign doesn't editorialize. It just lists them. To reach Hanakapiai, you walk 2 miles along the Kalalau Trail, one of the most visually dramatic coastal paths in the Pacific, cut into the face of the Na Pali cliffs above the ocean. The cliffs rise to over 1,000 meters in places, draped in vegetation, dropping sheer to the water. The trail itself is narrow, muddy in wet conditions, and requires genuine attention. But the walk is the reason people come. The views from the trail are the kind that stop conversation, and at the end of it, after 2 miles of effort, there is a beach. Hanakapiai is a crescent of sand at the base of a valley, enclosed by cliffs on 3 sides and open to the Pacific on the 4th. In summer, when swell is lower, sand accumulates and the beach is wide and accessible. In winter, the sand disappears almost entirely, scoured away by the same waves that deposited it, and what remains is a boulder field. The beach itself is seasonal. The danger is not. The specific hazard at Hanakapiai is rogue wave activity on a shore with no reef buffer. The Pali coastline faces northwest, directly into the path of North Pacific swell generated by storms thousands of kilometers away. That swell arrives without the gradual dissipation a reef would provide, hitting the beach at full energy. Rogue waves, not a metaphor, but a documented oceanographic phenomenon where wave trains constructively interfere to produce a wave significantly larger than the surrounding set, occur here with enough regularity that the National Park Service posts explicit warnings at the trailhead and at the beach itself. Do not stand near the water's edge. Do not turn your back to the ocean. Do not enter the water under any conditions. The warnings are specific because the mechanism is specific. A person standing on the boulders at what appears to be a safe distance from the waterline can be reached by a wave that arrives without the visual warning of a building set. There is no gradual escalation to signal that a larger wave is coming. It arrives, reaches further than the preceding waves, and recedes. The window between arrival and full recession is measured in seconds. The boulders are wet and algae covered. There is nowhere to run to that is both close enough and high enough. People have been swept from the boulder field at Hanakapiai while standing well back from what they judge to be the wave zone. The rescues that have been attempted are complicated by the same conditions that caused the incident. Active swell, no safe landing zone for watercraft, cliffs on 3 sides. Helicopter extraction has been used in documented rescue operations. Not every operation succeeded. The trail to Hanakapiai is legal, maintained, and open to the public without a permit for the first 2 miles. The beach at the end of it is not closed. The Park Service posts warnings, installs signs, and updates the drowning count on the trailhead board. Visitors arrive daily, complete the hike, and stand at the edge of one of the most beautiful beaches in Hawaii, reading a sign that tells them exactly what has happened to people who stood where they're standing. Some of them wade in anyway. The water, when the swell is low and the day is clear, is a particular shade of blue-green that doesn't photograph the way it looks in person. That's the detail that's hardest to account for in any risk calculation. Not the ignorance of the danger, but the knowledge of it alongside the presence of something genuinely worth seeing. The sign at the trailhead keeps getting updated. That's the whole story, really. At number 4, New Smyrna Beach, Florida, Volusia County. Florida has recorded more shark bites than any other county in the world, in most years on record. New Smyrna Beach sits within Volusia County. It has been documented by shark researchers as the most shark-bitten beach on Earth, measured by incidents per unit of coastline. That statistic has held across multiple decades of tracking by the International Shark Attack File, maintained at the University of Florida. It is not a local legend or tourism warning dressed up as data. It is the data. The geography explains it, and the geography is specific. New Smyrna Beach sits directly adjacent to Ponce de Leon Inlet, where the Indian River Lagoon system meets the Atlantic Ocean. The lagoon is a nursery habitat, warm, shallow, nutrient-rich, and home to large populations of mullet, menhaden, and other bait fish that juvenile and adult sharks feed on. The inlet is the channel through which those fish move between the lagoon and the open ocean, twice a day with the tide. Sharks position themselves in and around that channel to intercept the movement. The inlet is also where the surf breaks best along this stretch of coast, which is why the surfing community concentrated here in the first place. So you have a natural shark highway positioned directly beneath the best waves in the area. The surfers know this. Most of them have known it for years. The bite profile at New Smyrna is distinctive. The overwhelming majority of incidents involve surfers, not swimmers, and the majority of those involve the feet, ankles, and lower legs, the part of the body that dangles below a surfboard into water with limited visibility. The sharks involved are predominantly spinner sharks and blacktip sharks, both species that follow baitfish schools into the surf zone and are not targeting humans as prey. The bites are typically single strikes, investigatory contact in the language of shark researchers, rather than predatory attacks. This distinction matters in terms of survival rates. Fatalities at New Smyrna are rare. Bites are not. The local surf community has developed a specific relationship with the risk that is worth understanding on its own terms. Surfers at New Smyrna are aware of the statistics. The beach's reputation is not obscure. It circulates widely in surf culture, and the inlet break draws experienced surfers specifically because the waves are good, not despite the awareness of what shares the water. Some surfers describe seeing sharks regularly, particularly during mullet runs in autumn when the baitfish move through the inlet in dense schools and the sharks follow in numbers visible from the shore. During a mullet run, the water close to the inlet can hold dozens of sharks simultaneously. The surfers paddle out anyway. What this produces is a beach where the danger is ambient, documented, statistically significant, and essentially treated as a condition of use rather than a reason for closure. There are no shark nets at New Smyrna. There is no formal exclusion zone around the inlet. Flags are posted when sharks are visually confirmed near swimmers, but the inlet itself is not cordoned off. The beach is open, the surf is good, and the sharks are present in the water at concentrations that would, at almost any other beach in the world, produce a different response from authorities. The International Shark Attack File records for Volusia County show incidents distributed across decades without a clear downward trend. The numbers fluctuate year to year based on baitfish populations, water temperature, and surf activity levels. But the baseline presence of sharks in the surf zone at New Smyrna is not a seasonal anomaly. It's the permanent condition of a beach built at the mouth of a lagoon that functions as one of the most productive shark feeding grounds on the Atlantic coast. The waves at the inlet break over a sandbar in a way that produces a consistent, rideable right-hander. That's the detail that keeps the surfers coming. The same sandbar geometry that shapes the wave also concentrates the current that concentrates the baitfish that concentrates the sharks. The thing that makes the surf good and the thing that makes the water dangerous are not separate features of this beach. They are the same feature, seen from two different angles. 3. The Skeleton Coast, Namibia. Cold water meets hot desert at the edge of the southern Atlantic, and what that collision produces is fog. Not coastal haze, not morning mist that burns off by 10. Dense, persistent, disorientating fog that rolls in from the ocean and sits over the coastline for days at a time, reducing visibility to near zero across a stretch of shore that runs roughly 500 kilometers, about the distance from London to Edinburgh, along the northwestern edge of Namibia. The mechanism is specific. The Benguela Current carries cold water up from the deep South Atlantic along the Namibian coast. The Namib Desert, one of the oldest and driest deserts on Earth, pushes heat seaward from the land. Where cold ocean air meets hot desert air, condensation is immediate and sustained. The fog is not weather in the conventional sense. It's a structural feature of this coastline as reliable as the tide and far less predictable in its timing. For centuries, this fog was the primary killer. Portuguese sailors named the coastline the Costa do Inferno, the coast of hell, in the early period of Atlantic exploration. Later navigators called it the Skeleton Coast. Both names came from the same source: ships that entered the fog, lost their bearings, and drove onto the shore. The coast offered no harbor, no fresh water, no shelter, and no possibility of rescue. Survivors of shipwrecks who made it to the beach faced the Namib Desert behind them and the Atlantic in front. The desert won, consistently. The physical evidence is still there. Rusted hulls, reduced to ribs, and plate sections half buried in the sand appear along the shoreline at irregular intervals, some dating to the early 20th century, some more recent. The Edward Bolen, a cargo steamer that ran aground in 1910, now sits several hundred meters inland, swallowed by the advancing desert dunes over more than a century. The ship didn't move. The desert moved around it. It sits tilted in the sand, its hull oxidized to deep orange with dunes building against its hull on one side. You can walk to it across dry land. The ocean it wrecked in is no longer visible from where it rests. The San Bushmen who knew this coastline before European contact called it by a name that translates roughly as the land God made in anger. The Ovahimba people, whose territory borders the northern section, maintained a similar relationship with the coast. Respectful distance, not habitation. The coastline was not a place where people lived. It was a place that things washed up on. The Skeleton Coast is now a national park, covering approximately 20,000 square kilometers, an area larger than Wales. The southern section is accessible to self-drive visitors with appropriate permits. The northern section above the Huaruseeb River is accessible only by fly and safari, and the number of visitors permitted annually is tightly controlled by the Namibian government. The restriction is partly conservation, partly the genuine logistical reality that if something goes wrong in the northern Skeleton Coast, extraction is not straightforward. The wildlife here is one of the stranger consequences of the fog. The moisture the fog deposits supports a thin biological layer, lichens, succulents, insects, that sustains a food chain extending to desert-adapted lions, brown hyenas, and one of the few populations of desert elephants on Earth. The same fog that killed the ships waters the desert. The same coastline that the Portuguese called hell supports a functioning, if sparse, ecosystem that exists almost nowhere else. Brown fur seals congregate at Cape Cross in numbers that have to be seen to be processed. The colony there holds upward of 100,000 animals at peak season, their calls audible from a significant distance, the smell preceding them by further still. Great white sharks and other large sharks work the waters offshore, feeding on the seals. The same cold current that generates the fog also drives the upwelling of nutrients that makes these waters among the most biologically productive in the southern hemisphere. So the Skeleton Coast is simultaneously a graveyard, a wildlife reserve, a fog machine, and one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the Atlantic. The ships that wrecked here fed the birds that fed the seals, that feed the sharks, that patrol the same water. The fog still rolls across every morning. The Edward Bolen's compass, if it still existed, would point toward open ocean. The ocean is now 300 meters away, on the other side of a dune. Number 2. Boa Viagem, Recife, Brazil. Between 1992 and 2012, 56 shark attacks were recorded at Boa Viagem Beach. Of those, 19 were fatal. That attack rate, measured against the beach length and the volume of users, is among the highest of any urban beach on Earth. Not remote coastline, not an isolated research station, an urban beach inside a major Brazilian city, bordered by apartment blocks and hotels, used daily by residents who have limited access to alternative coastline. Boa Viagem runs for roughly 8 kilometers along the southern coast of Recife, the capital of Pernambuco state in northeastern Brazil. The beach is wide, the sand is pale, and the water close to shore is shallow enough to wade in for considerable distance. On weekends, the beach draws crowds. It has always drawn crowds. Recife is a coastal city and Boa Viagem is its waterfront. The relationship between the city and the beach predates the attacks, which is part of what makes the situation so difficult to resolve. The beach is not optional infrastructure for the people who use it. The attacks began in earnest in the early 1990s, and the cause was identified relatively quickly by researchers. In the 1980s, the port of Suape was constructed approximately 40 kilometers south of Recife. The construction required clearing and filling mangrove estuaries that had functioned for generations as nursery habitat for bull sharks. Shallow, sheltered, food-rich environments where juvenile sharks develop before moving into open water. When the mangroves were destroyed, the sharks lost their nursery grounds. They relocated. The area they relocated to, following the food supply and the warm, shallow water they prefer, was the coast directly adjacent to Recife. Bull sharks are specifically adapted to this kind of environment. Not X, not a deep water predator that occasionally approaches shore, not Y, not a species that requires open ocean to hunt. Bull sharks are euryhaline, meaning they tolerate a wide range of salinity, and they are documented in rivers, estuaries, harbors, and surf zones worldwide. They are one of the few large shark species that actively prefers shallow, turbid, nearshore water, exactly the conditions at Boa Viajam. The same warm shallows that make the beach comfortable for wading make it functionally ideal for bull sharks. The water visibility at Boa Viajam is low. River discharge from the Capibaribe and Beberibe rivers empties into the sea near Recife, carrying sediment that keeps the water murky close to shore. A shark in that water is not visible from the surface. The attacks at Boa Viajam have predominantly occurred in shallow water, some in depths of less than 1.5 meters, and many have involved surfers whose boards and paddling motions at the surface produce signals that bull sharks associate with prey. Pernambuco state authorities responded to the attack spike with a series of measures over the years: shark nets at designated swimming areas, signage, restrictions on surfing in certain zones, and a monitoring program that has tracked shark movements using acoustic tagging. The monitoring data confirmed what the attack pattern suggested. Bull sharks are resident in the waters off Boa Viajam year-round, not seasonal visitors. They are not passing through, they are there. The nets helped. The attack rate dropped from its peak in the 1990s, but the nets cover only a portion of the beach, require maintenance, and do not extend to the areas where surfing occurs. Attacks continued after the nets were installed, at lower frequency but not zero frequency. The most recent documented attacks in available records occurred well into the 2000s and beyond, suggesting the underlying conditions: resident bull shark population, low visibility water, high human use, have not changed in any fundamental way. What happened at Boa Viajam is not a story about a beach that was always dangerous. It's a story about an engineering decision made 40 kilometers away in a different decade for reasons that had nothing to do with sharks, that permanently altered the predator ecology of an entire urban coastline. The port needed land. The mangroves were in the way. The sharks needed somewhere to go. The people of Recife didn't move the sharks into their water. A construction project did. And the beach, which was there before the port and before the attacks, is still there. Still used, still monitored. The sharks didn't choose Boa Viajam. The city chose it for them without knowing it was making that choice. Whether that distinction matters to someone standing in 1.5 meters of murky water is a separate question entirely. 1. Shitovaya Bukhta, Russia, and almost no one knows it exists. Shitovaya Bukhta is a bay on the Kamchatka Peninsula on Russia's far eastern coast, where the Pacific meets one of the most geologically active landmasses on Earth. Kamchatka sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. It has more than 300 volcanoes, of which around 30 are considered active. The peninsula is roughly the size of California and has a permanent population of around 300,000 people, most of them concentrated in the regional capital, Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. The coastline is vast, largely uninhabited, and in places still being measured for what it contains. Shitovaya Bukhta itself is a small bay in the Avacha Gulf region, and its specific danger profile is not geological. It sits in proximity to former Soviet military infrastructure, submarine bases that operated during the Cold War along the Kamchatka coast, some of which handled nuclear-powered vessels. The Soviet Pacific Fleet maintained significant nuclear submarine operations in this region from the 1960s onward. The infrastructure for those operations, fuel storage, maintenance facilities, the submarines themselves, has not all been cleanly decommissioned. Some of it corroded in place. Some of it sank. The water temperature in the bay rarely exceeds 4 degrees Celsius, roughly the temperature of a domestic refrigerator. At that temperature, cold water shock and swimming failure can incapacitate an unprotected person within minutes. Hypothermia. To the point of incapacitation follows within 10 to 15 minutes of immersion without a dry suit. This is not a survivable swim. The cold is not ambient background. It is the primary physical barrier between a person and the water, and it works without fail. But the cold is the visible danger. The less visible one is radiological. Monitoring of waters along the Kamchatka coast for radioactive contamination has been conducted periodically by Russian authorities and by independent researchers, particularly following the increased international attention on Soviet-era nuclear waste disposal in the Pacific that emerged after the Cold War ended. What those surveys found in the broader Avacha Gulf region and along sections of the Kamchatka coastline were elevated readings in specific locations, not uniformly, not at levels that triggered immediate public health emergencies, but present, documented, and in some cases unexplained by natural background radiation alone. The sources are not always identified with precision: decommissioned submarines, dumped reactor components, contaminated coolant water from naval operations conducted across decades with record keeping that was classified, incomplete, or both. The Russian government has conducted cleanup operations in the region, with international assistance in some cases under agreements reached in the 1990s and 2000s to address Soviet-era nuclear legacy sites. The scope of what was left behind, in the water, on the seafloor, in the sediment of bays along this coastline, is still being fully characterized. Some surveys have been published. Others remain within Russian federal jurisdiction and are not publicly available. What this produces is a coastline where the danger is not a predator, not a current, not a wave. It's a residue, something left in the water by decisions made in a different political era, by an institution that no longer exists, for strategic purposes that are now historical record. The bay doesn't announce this. It looks like every other bay on the Kamchatka coast: gray water, volcanic peaks behind the tree line, the kind of landscape that reads as remote and elemental and indifferent to human presence. Almost no tourists come here. The region requires permits for foreign visitors in certain areas due to its proximity to military infrastructure and the logistics of reaching Kamchatka at all. It has no road connection to the Russian mainland, accessible only by air or sea. Filter out casual visitors effectively. The people who come to Kamchatka come for the volcanoes, the brown bears, the salmon rivers. They don't come for the bays. So, Shitovaya Bukhta sits largely unvisited. The water is 4 degrees. The monitoring continues sporadically in the broader region. The seafloor in the Avacha Gulf holds objects that have been there for 50 or 60 years, in water cold enough to slow corrosion but not stop it. What's inside some of those objects is still, in the most literal sense, an open question, one that the water keeps to itself, in the dark, at 4 degrees, while the volcanoes above the treeline go on doing what they've always done. The bay doesn't look dangerous. That's the last thing worth knowing about it.